The graveyard stood in silence, wrapped in moss and shadow. For over a century, people in the nearby town avoided this place. They whispered about the third row, the second stone, the one carved only with the initials JC 1824. The elders warned their children never to step near it after sunset. The ground there moves, they said. It rises and falls as if someone underneath is still breathing. Every legend begins with a fragment of truth, and this one begins with the disappearance of a man named Jonathan Claiborne. In the early 1820s, Claiborne was a wealthy plantation master, feared more than he was respected. Records describe him as a man of strict control, one who measured his worth not in kindness but in acres and in the number of lives he owned. He was ruthless in business, cold in temperament, and to those who worked his fields, his presence was a weight that never lifted. Then, without warning, he was gone. The official account was simple. Jonathan Claiborne had died of a sudden fever. A quiet burial, no priest, no ceremony, no public farewell. A coffin lowered into the dirt, a stone placed above, and silence sealed the matter. His family claimed it was an illness, but their voices shook when they spoke. In the town ledger, his death was recorded in one plain line: deceased, natural cause. But not everyone believed it. Among those who witnessed the burial was a man named Samuel, one of the enslaved forced to dig graves for the Plantation family. Samuel was quiet, observant, and cautious with his words. Years later, long after he was sold away, he confided to someone he trusted. He told them that on the night Claiborne was buried, he heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He heard the coffin rattle. He heard fists striking the wood. He heard his own name called, muffled but desperate. Samuel's words vanished with him, for not long after, he was taken south, sold to another master. His story would have been forgotten like so many others, if not for the fact that it matched what people already feared, that Jonathan Claiborne had not been dead when the soil closed over him. Why would anyone bury a man alive? Some believe it was a mistake, the result of primitive medicine in a time when the line between life and death was hard to prove. Others argue it was deliberate. Some say his own family plotted against him, eager to inherit his land and silence his temper. But the most chilling theory belongs to those who labored in his fields. For them, this was not an accident. It was justice, a punishment chosen not by law or church, but by the hands of those who had endured his cruelty for too long. The rumors spread like smoke, but they were never written down in detail. The Claiborne family insisted Jonathan had gone abroad, that he had left America entirely. They spoke of letters sent from Europe, though no one outside the family ever saw them. Yet the grave remained marked and immovable, holding its secret beneath stone and earth. For 100 years, the people of that county avoided the place. They swore that animals refused to graze near the grave. They told stories of children who wandered too close and came back pale, trembling, unable to explain why they cried. The silence around the grave became part of the legend. Everyone knew it, but no one dared speak it loudly. Then, in the 1920s, during a renovation of the old cemetery, the ground was disturbed. Workers uncovered a coffin, rotten with age, its lid cracked open by time. Inside, the skeleton lay not in peace but in torment. The bones were twisted, the skull turned sideways, the hands clenched into claws. Scratches covered the inside of the wood. Fingers were broken, teeth marks scarred the lid. Every mark told the same story. Jonathan Claiborne had been alive when they buried him. The discovery was briefly reported in small-town newspapers. One article described it in chilling detail. Bones found in unnatural position, coffin lid marked with violent scratches. But the story was quickly suppressed. The Claiborne descendants, still wealthy and influential, bought silence where they could. The articles disappeared. The bones were quietly reburied. Yet by then the whispers had already returned, stronger than before. Who buried Jonathan Claiborne alive? Was it his family eager to erase him? Was it a mistake of doctors and superstition? Or was it the final act of defiance by those he enslaved? A revenge hidden so carefully that it survived only in shadows. Claiborne died twice. First when his power ended, and again when the air in his coffin ran out. His grave still stands, a stone marked with initials and a date, but no epitaph, no prayer, no word of remembrance. It is as if the earth itself refuses to let his story rest. This is only the beginning. The grave tells us he was buried alive, but the letters hidden in trunks, The records smuggled out of the plantation and the secret testimonies passed from one generation to the next tell us why. The secret letters. When Jonathan Claiborne's coffin was opened nearly a century after his death, the horror of what they found raised a question larger than the scratches inside the lid. Who wanted him gone badly enough to see him buried alive? Accidents could be explained. Medicine in the early 1800s was crude. Doctors often mistook coma for death, and the line between the two was frighteningly thin. But an accident could not explain the silence, the secrecy, or the sudden disappearance of plantation records. It could not explain why no priest blessed the grave, why no neighbors came to mourn, or why the Claiborne family insisted Jonathan had sailed away to Europe. The answer, historians later realized, was buried not in the ground but in paper, in trunks and drawers locked away in attics, in letters passed down through families too frightened to share them openly. Over time, those letters revealed not just a death but a conspiracy. The first letter surfaced in 1911, written in faded ink by Jonathan's wife, Eleanor. Addressed to her sister, it spoke of a house divided by terror. Eleanor described Jonathan's cruelty not in the language of law, but in whispers of bruises, broken dishes, and nights where his temper thundered louder than storms outside. She hinted at debts, at hidden arguments with neighbors, at a fear that their children would inherit not just his land but his rage. Her letter ended abruptly with a line that chilled the scholar who first read it. "If the Lord will not take him, then the earth must." Another letter, discovered decades later, came from the plantation overseer, a man named Henry Doyle. Doyle had worked closely with Jonathan, enforcing his orders on the enslaved workers with a whip and ledger book. But even Doyle, hardened by years of brutality, seemed shaken by Claiborne's decline. His words, written in a private journal, described the master as a man whose heart rots though his body still lives. He spoke of Jonathan's paranoia, of doors locked from the inside, of sleepless nights pacing with pistol in hand. Doyle claimed Jonathan accused his own family of plotting against him, muttering that they would rather see me underground than seated at their table. The most damning testimony, however, did not come from the family or overseer. It came from a man who had once been enslaved on the Claiborne estate, and who, after gaining freedom in the years following the Civil War, told his story to a local minister. His name was Isaac. He remembered the night Jonathan was carried to the grave. He remembered the family standing close together, their faces pale in the moonlight. He remembered how no one called for a doctor, though Jonathan had collapsed only hours earlier. Isaac swore that Jonathan was still breathing when the lid was nailed shut. Isaac's testimony was written down by the minister, then hidden in church records for decades. When uncovered, it revealed details that connected with Samuel's earlier whispers. The faint cries, the rattling coffin, the sound of fists against wood. But Isaac added something more. He claimed Eleanor herself gave the order to bury Jonathan quickly. "She said he was gone," Isaac recounted, but her hands shook when she spoke it. She would not look at the box as it was lowered. This convergence of evidence, Eleanor's letter, Doyle's journal, Isaac's testimony, painted a chilling picture. Jonathan Claiborne was not merely a cruel master. He was a man so despised, so feared, that even his family may have wanted him erased. His burial was not a mistake of medicine. It was a decision. The question is why. Some historians argue Eleanor orchestrated the burial to save her children from inheriting his wrath. If Jonathan lived, she feared, the children would suffer as she had. By burying him, she cut off the cycle, sacrificing her own soul to protect theirs. Others suggest the enslaved community took matters into their own hands. Quietly, carefully, they may have staged the death, convincing the family Jonathan had passed when in truth he had only collapsed. To them, it was justice. To them, it was freedom in the only form they could manage. If this theory is true, Eleanor's trembling silence at the grave makes sense. She knew what was happening, but she let it unfold. Then there is a darker theory, one whispered in academic circles but rarely spoken aloud. Jonathan's own brother stood to inherit much of his land. Letters found in a courthouse archive reveal bitter disputes over property lines, debts owed, and contracts broken. If Jonathan vanished, his brother prospered. If Jonathan died, the inheritance shifted. Could it be that the burial was not revenge or mercy, but greed? Each letter, each testimony adds weight to one theory and weakens another. But the common thread is this: no one truly mourned Jonathan Claiborne. His death was not followed by prayers or songs. It was followed by silence, as if a plague had finally the missing ledgers. On every plantation, there were books that told more than any sermon or family story ever could. They were ledgers, columns of names, numbers, and transactions written in careful ink. To Jonathan Claiborne, those ledgers were the heart of his empire. They recorded cotton sold, debts owed, barrels of corn counted, and most disturbingly, the buying and selling of human lives. Every name of every man, woman, and child he owned was reduced to an entry in those books. Neighbors said Jonathan kept 3 ledgers. The first was for public eyes, the one he showed when visitors came or when taxes were due. The second was private, recording secret dealings, illegal trades, and debts he could not admit. The third, according to rumor, was the most dangerous of all. It contained not only numbers but confessions, notes about punishments given, arguments with his wife, suspicions of betrayal, even the names of local officials he bribed to keep his estate running smoothly. When Jonathan's death was recorded, none of those ledgers were ever seen again. Not a single page survived in county records. Not a single book remained in the family home. It was as if they had vanished overnight. For decades, people assumed they were lost to fire or flood. But a century later, fragments began to surface, tucked inside trunks hidden behind church pews, and smuggled through families who wanted to forget but could not quite destroy. The first fragment appeared in the attic of a house miles from the plantation. A worker renovating the roof found a box sealed with wax. Inside were pages written in Jonathan's own hand. The ink was smudged, the corners torn, but the words were legible. One entry read, "Debt grows with each passing week. I have promised more than the fields can give. Doyle says the hands cannot work harder, but I know they can. They must." This single line revealed the truth Jonathan had hidden. His wealth was collapsing. Behind the facade of power and cruelty was a man drowning in debt. To his neighbors, he seemed untouchable, but his ledger confessed otherwise. He owed money to merchants, bankers, even his own brother. His estate was crumbling, and the only way to hold it together was to squeeze more from the enslaved workers who already had nothing left to give. Another page listed names, each followed by a number. Isaac, Samuel, Ruth, Hannah, Elias. Next to Isaac's name, 450. Next to Ruth's, 300. These were not wages. They were prices, the value Jonathan assigned to human beings, ready to sell if the debt collectors came calling. Entire families reduced to figures in a failing man's book. But one entry stood out more than any other. It read, "If Eleanor betrays me, she will regret it. She is not faithful. She writes to her sister in secret. I have taken the letters. If she continues, she will join the others in the ground." The handwriting grew shaky at the edges as if written in anger. This was not the voice of a calm master, but of a man unraveling. If Eleanor truly feared him, as her own letters suggest, this passage explains why. He was watching her every move, suspicious of her loyalties, threatening her life. Another ledger fragment, discovered in a courthouse basement during an archive search, revealed a list of payments to a sheriff. $5, $10, even a horse. Each entry followed by the initials HD. This matched the overseer's name, Henry Doyle. Claiborne was paying the sheriff through Doyle, ensuring that no matter what happened on his estate, the law looked the other way. But the most chilling discovery was a half-page note, burned at the edges, found in a church trunk. It read, "The burial must be quick. Do not let him wake again. The earth will keep him quiet. Ledger 3 must not be found." No signature, no date, just the words. But the implication was clear. Someone close to Jonathan orchestrated his burial, and they knew those ledgers were the key to proving why. For years, historians debated whether the missing ledgers were destroyed by fire, stolen by family, or hidden by those who wanted justice. Yet the fragments suggest something more deliberate. They were scattered, cut apart, divided between different hands so no single person could ever hold the full story. Like bones from a body, each fragment is incomplete on its own. But when pieced together, they reveal a corpse of truth. Jonathan Claiborne was not a man of strength and order, but of weakness, paranoia, and corruption. The enslaved people on his estate must have known it too. They watched him grow desperate, lashing out as debts piled higher. They heard his rage when Eleanor defied him. They saw him pay off sheriffs, bribe judges, and curse his own brother. In those ledgers, they were numbers, But outside the books, they were eyes and ears, remembering every crack in his armor. If Jonathan's death was truly staged, the ledgers give motive. His wife wanted freedom from his threats. His brother wanted inheritance. The enslaved wanted justice. And the overseer, Doyle, may have wanted to protect himself, for his name appeared in those pages more than any other. The night Jonathan collapsed, the ledgers vanished. Perhaps Eleanor took them, slipping pages into trunks she later sealed. Perhaps Isaac or Samuel smuggled out scraps, hoping one day their children could use them as proof. Perhaps Doyle burned the rest, terrified his corruption would be exposed. What is certain is this: the disappearance of the ledgers was no accident. They were silenced, just as Jonathan was. But unlike Jonathan, the ledgers refused to stay buried. Each fragment that surfaces pulls back another layer of the story. And the more we read, the more we realize his burial was not the end of a cruel man. It was the final act of a drama written in ink long before the coffin closed. The missing ledgers remind us that history is not only written by the victors, sometimes it is hidden by the guilty. Sometimes it is scattered by the oppressed who risked everything to preserve the truth in scraps and whispers. And sometimes it waits for us to find it, 100 years too late. The grave still holds Jonathan Claiborne's bones, but the ledgers, torn apart and scattered, hold his soul, a soul heavy with death's secrets and sins. And with every page that returns to light, the question grows sharper: who truly buried him and why? In Part 4, we follow the trail of Eleanor Claiborne herself, the woman who wrote of terror, the wife whose trembling voice ordered the grave sealed. Was she a victim, a conspirator, or the true hand behind Jonathan's burial alive? Eleanor Claiborne's name appears only in whispers, but those whispers have carried for more than a century. In a world where wives were expected to remain silent, she dared to leave behind fragments of her own voice. Her letters, delicate on faded paper, describe a woman trapped inside a house that was both her home and her prison. She wrote of long nights without sleep, of doors locked from the outside, of the sound of Jonathan's boots echoing through the halls as if each step was a warning. She confessed to her sister that the air inside the plantation home felt heavier than the soil outside, that her husband's shadow followed her even when he was not in the room. One letter survives in nearly complete form. The ink has bled, but her words are still sharp. I fear him, and yet I fear the thought of what I must do more. He does not trust me. He searches my belongings, he seizes my letters. I am watched as though I were a prisoner, but if I remain still, I shall die before my time, whether by his hand or by my own despair. This was not the voice of a woman resigned. It was the voice of someone planning, someone who had weighed her choices and realized silence would no longer protect her. Neighbors remembered Eleanor as fragile, often seen standing by the upstairs windows, pale against the curtain, staring out at the fields. They called her quiet, but her quietness was not weakness. Behind the glass, she watched the workers, the overseers, and her husband's growing paranoia. She learned to read his temper the way others read the sky before a storm, and she was patient. Jonathan Claiborne was loud, forceful, and cruel. Eleanor was deliberate. She waited for the moment when his own rage would blind him. The missing ledgers suggest she knew about his debts. One fragment mentions letters hidden in the sewing room, and historians believe these were her copies of Jonathan's financial dealings. If so, Eleanor may have understood better than anyone how close her husband was to collapse. And in that collapse she saw her chance. For a woman in her time, divorce was nearly impossible, escape nearly unthinkable, but widowhood, however sudden, offered freedom. On the night of Jonathan's death, witnesses claimed Eleanor gave the order to bury quickly. "Do not wait for the doctor," she is said to have insisted. "He is gone, and the earth will keep him." Some dismissed this as the grief of a frightened wife, but others saw something colder: determination. She did not wail, she did not faint, she did not beg for help. She directed, she instructed, and within hours the master of the estate was sealed in the ground, his lips still stained with whatever had taken his life. Tyranny is never the work of one man alone. It is built on the obedience of those willing to carry out his will. As the years passed, the legend of Doyle grew. Some claimed his ghost returned to the fields, cracking a whip that no one could see. Others said his soul wandered, searching for the silver watch he lost in a tavern brawl. Still others insisted he lived to old age under another name, never speaking of the night he pressed his boot on the coffin of his master. Whether ghost, exile, or liar, Doyle's place in the Claiborne story remains fixed. He was there, shovel in hand, when Jonathan Claiborne was sealed beneath the earth, and perhaps that is enough. For in the end, history is not built on certainty but on memory, and the memory of Henry Doyle is that of a man who chose silence, profit, and fear over humanity. His role may never be fully known, but his shadow lingers stitched into every retelling of the Claiborne burial. Without him, the grave would not have closed so quickly. Without him, the story would not burn so fiercely today. The night after Jonathan Claiborne was buried, the plantation was not silent. The cicadas droned in the trees. The wind moved through the cane, but beneath those ordinary sounds was something sharper, something that made even the strongest hearts beat faster. In the quarters, the people gathered in small circles, whispering so softly that even the walls could barely hear. They spoke of what they had seen, the hurried burial, the master's face pale but not at peace, the overseer's trembling hands, the widow's cold command to cover the coffin. Some said they heard movement beneath the lid as the last shovelfuls of earth fell. Others swore it was imagination, the mind playing cruel tricks. But the whispers kept circling, feeding each other like sparks feeding a fire. If Jonathan was not truly dead, then the earth itself had swallowed him alive. And if he was gone for good, then the ground held not just a body but a victory. Around the fire that night, Samuel spoke first. He was younger than Isaac but bolder, his voice carrying more heat than caution. "The master will not return," he said, eyes fixed on the flames. "The ground has taken him, we saw it. We felt it." His words brought a hush. Some nodded, relief breaking across faces like dawn. Others looked away, afraid even to agree. Ruth, who had lived through more winters than most, shook her head slowly. "The earth keeps secrets, but it does not always keep them kind. If he wakes in that box, he will claw his way back to us. Do not think death is a chain stronger than iron." Her warning settled heavy over them, and for a moment the fire seemed to dim. Isaac sat apart, listening. His silence carried weight, for when Isaac spoke, people listened. At last he said, "We must not fear the ground. If he wakes, the earth will hold him tighter. And if he does not, then the burden is lifted from us all. But we must remember. We must carry this night with us because others will not believe." His words were measured, but they cut deep. The quarters knew that truth did not live in books or courts. It lived in their memories, in the way stories were passed from tongue to ear, from parent to child. The children listened wide-eyed, sensing the importance even if they could not yet understand it. They would grow up knowing this night as the turning point, the night when a master fell and the earth became both grave and witness. For them, the fear of Jonathan Claiborne would never be as sharp as it had been for their parents, because they had seen that even masters could be broken. That night, songs rose in low voices, not loud enough for the big house to hear, but enough to bind the people together. Songs of deliverance, of chains breaking, of rivers carrying souls to freedom. The melodies wove through the air like threads of hope. They did not celebrate openly. Such defiance would be punished. But in the quiet of the quarters, the songs carried a message clear as sunrise. The master was gone, and with him, a piece of their suffering. Yet fear still lingered. They knew the overseer remained. They knew debts would bring new masters, new hands of cruelty. But for that night, they allowed themselves a fragile relief. Children slept without trembling. Mothers whispered blessings over them. Men sat with shoulders less heavy. The plantation had shifted, and though the chains were still there, something in the air felt different. Days later, when strangers asked about Jonathan's death, the quarters spoke carefully. They repeated the words Eleanor had given. He had fallen, he had passed, he had been buried. But among themselves, they told another story. The story of the grave that might still hold a man breathing. The story of the overseer who pressed his boot against the coffin. The story of the earth closing around cruelty and swallowing it whole. And so the legend began, not in books, not in letters, but in whispers carried from mouth to mouth, across fields and rivers, down generations. It was not just the story of Jonathan Claiborne's burial. It was the story of survival, of memory, of voices refusing to be silenced. For the enslaved, the burial was more than death. It was proof that even the powerful could fall, that the soil itself could turn against those who claimed to own it. In that way, the quarters kept their own kind of ledger. Not ink on paper, but memory etched into hearts. And unlike Jonathan's books, this ledger could not be stolen, burned, or hidden. It lived on, carried in stories told in the dark, in songs hummed beneath breath, in the gaze of those who remembered. It lived in the truth that even if the master was buried alive, the people who buried him carried the greater victory. They had endured, and they had seen the ground claim one who had thought himself untouchable. Years passed, and the Claiborne estate did not recover. The fields grew wild at the edges, fences broke and leaned, and the big house that once cast its shadow with authority began to decay from the inside. Jonathan's absence left a hollow that no overseer, no widow, and no banker could fill. What had been a kingdom of fear crumbled into uncertainty. Eleanor kept the shutters drawn most days. Neighbors rarely saw her beyond the garden gate, and when they did, her figure seemed smaller, paler, like a candle burning lower each night. She spoke little, and when she did, her words carried weight but not warmth. Rumors spread that she wandered the halls at night, speaking softly to no one, her voice rising and falling as if in conversation with the dead. Servants claimed they heard her footsteps above their heads even when she was seated before them. Some swore they caught sight of her standing by the grave in the moonlight, her white dress glowing like a specter's. Henry Doyle was gone, vanished without warning, and with him disappeared the last thread of order. The enslaved continued their work, but the rhythm had changed. Without Jonathan's iron grip, there was space, small, fragile, but undeniable. Isaac began to take quiet leadership, advising others, mediating disputes, encouraging patience. Samuel's boldness grew into defiance, though carefully measured so as not to provoke retribution. Ruth, the elder, guided them with memory, reminding them that survival was more than endurance. It was a form of resistance. Outside the plantation, whispers about Jonathan's strange burial began to seep into town. Merchants asked why no doctor had confirmed the death. Farmers wondered why the widow refused to hold a proper memorial. Children whispered to each other that Claiborne had clawed at his coffin, that he still walked beneath the earth. The story twisted as it traveled, becoming both more grotesque and more compelling. When bankers arrived to settle debts, they found the ledgers missing. Eleanor offered polite confusion, claiming Jonathan kept his papers hidden and she could not account for them. The men left dissatisfied, but there was little they could do without evidence. Some suspected Eleanor destroyed the books. Others believed Doyle had stolen them before he fled. None considered the possibility that pieces of the ledgers had been smuggled away by the very people whose names filled their pages. The estate began to fracture. Parcels of land were sold off. Families were separated once more. Some sent to distant plantations, others forced into town labor. Yet even as the physical bonds shifted, the story of Jonathan's burial spread among those who left. In cabins miles away, on roads leading south by rivers where goods were ferried, the tale was told again and again. The master who ruled with cruelty, the hasty grave, the sound of earth closing too soon. Each retelling carried a piece of truth and a piece of legend, woven so tightly together they could not be pulled apart. For those who had lived it, the memory was sharp, a scar never fading. For those who only heard it, the tale became a spark, proof that masters could fall, that the world could turn. In a time when hope was dangerous, the story itself became a form of resistance. Part in next video. Thanks for watching. Subscribe the channel.